What's the best method to help, like, comfort those people?
People who are neurotic.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to depend on exactly what they're worried about. A lot of times it's a fear of negative social evaluation. So you can use a technique that it's cognitive behavioral therapy. I mean, I'm not suggesting that anybody go out and do therapy on people because you need a lot of training to do that. But one thing that the therapist will do is they will, like if someone has a lot of social anxiety, they will try to alter that person's thought processes by giving them homework assignments. Like you might say, all right, you're worried that if you talk to people they're going to reject you. Well, go up and just talk to some people. See how they treat you. And then take note of that and come back next week and we'll talk about that. And that person will go out and talk to some new people and they'll find out those people are generally nice, and then the therapist will try to make the person incorporate that into their view of the world. And it's a challenge because, as we've said, personality is pretty stable, but people can get some help for social anxiety.
You said modern people focus more on the id or the ego?
Modern theorists focus more on the ego, whereas Freud focused more on the id. Yeah.
On chapter 4, this is mostly the problems with measures related to the express consistency and socially.
Yeah. So problems with trait measures and ways that they can be addressed. All right. So these were two of the problems that we talked about: fatigue and socially desirable responding. So what were those two? What was fatigue first?
They were really long,
Mm-hmm.
and it helps if you like take breaks or you have them come in twice, not just one for 3 hours.
Exactly, yeah. So
Like that.
sometimes these surveys can be really long, like you were saying, and then I heard you say when people stop caring. They get tired, they get fatigued. And so ways to combat that involve giving them a break, having them come in 2 different times to complete the different sections of that. Yeah. And then what was socially desirable responding?
Oh, it's like a personal question you're gonna answer to like look good. Is like, oh my God, so many people are gonna read this, and I'm gonna look really bad. So they're gonna answer like what the norms tell you to do, kind of.
Yeah. So when you're answering a question about yourself, then you want to present yourself in a positive light. And so when people are filling out these personality questionnaires, there's a concern that they won't answer in a completely honest manner because they think, well, the researcher might read this and they'll think I'm a bad person if I answer this honestly. And so what were some ways to combat socially desirable responding?
Tell them that it's going to be, there's going to be a lot of texting. You got to test it.
Okay, yeah, so we talked about the false pipeline method, and that's one of the more interesting ones that can be used to try to get around socially desirable responding on things like questions of racist attitudes and things like that. Although that one isn't all that commonly used because according to APA guidelines, we shouldn't deceive people unless we absolutely have to for the purposes of the experiment. So what were some other techniques?
Assuring them that no one else will see what they're seeing.
Yeah, so that's the most basic and one that's always done, is just assuring people that nobody is going to see their responses, that their answers will be kept confidential, they won't be matched up with their name, so you're letting them know that everything's going to stay private, and so they should feel free to answer it as openly and honestly as possible. Right. Any other?
Encourage honesty.
Yeah, just straight up tell them this research isn't going to work unless you are honest. It's really important for us that you be honest, and then you can kind of go into some of the confidentiality and privacy stuff.
Have like a locked box and have them like put it in there so like no one knows which one's his or theirs.
Yeah, that's a specific method that we do sometimes is in order to ensure privacy is, and we would do this with sexuality questionnaires where people would answer some really personal questions. just have them slide the thing into a box, the completed questionnaire into a box, or do it on the computer, rather than having them hand a completed questionnaire to a real person. Any others?
It's on chapter 15.
All right.
The last one says, I'm sorry. It's chapter 16. It says, be familiar with the 6 differences discussed in class.
Okay, yeah. So this was from the sex differences chapter, and granted, this is kind of a broad question, but I did that on purpose because I don't want to give away too much about the actual exam. But we reviewed a bunch of different areas where men and women are more similar or more different. So what were some of the areas in which men and women were different? Okay, so that was one from another chapter. We talked about differences in manipulation strategies, and women were more likely to use the strategy of regression, so using whining and crying to get what they want. And that was a small sex difference, but it was one that was significant.
Was it sex thing? Was it?
Yeah, sexuality is a big one. Men tend to prefer a higher number of casual sexual partners. Mm-hmm.
Men are more aggressive.
Yeah, more physically aggressive. Men do tend, if you look at the sex difference in homicide rate, it's like night and day. Men are just killing people left and right, and comparatively speaking. And whereas women do commit some homicides, it's nowhere near equivalent in proportion to what men do. Mm-hmm.
Women were more social.
Yeah. So women tend to be more sociable. They react in, so there's a sex difference in how people react under stress. There's tend and befriend versus fight and flight. Did we talk about that in here? Okay. It's probably not on the exam because I think that's something from my intro class. But when men are under stress, they tend to lash out violently. They go into fight or flight mode. Women are a little bit more likely to seek out social support. They go into tend and befriend mode, and you actually see that across a whole bunch of different mammalian species. Even rats have the same type of behavior pattern. Yeah.
There was one thing that was on one of our tests where we discussed why men were more violent than women. It had something to do with their reproduction or something, remember?
Yeah. So we talked about the ultimate evolutionary explanation for greater levels of aggression and risk-taking in men. And that one was kind of a complex explanation. And what it boils down to is men, there's greater reproductive variability for men, which means that over the history of the human species, there were a lot of men that failed to ever have any kids at all. So their total number of offspring is 0. And there were some men who had lots and lots of kids. So you have these rulers, and in ancient times you had these harems, and so they would have literally hundreds, if not thousands, of offspring. And so if you compare that difference, that's pretty big between the men who had the most kids and the men who had 0 kids. Whereas with women, you had some women who never had any children, and then you have some that had up to 20. But that range, it's much more restricted for women than it is for men. So the idea is that because you have this greater amount of variability in male reproductive success, men had to compete with one another more. And the men who won had this big benefit compared to the men who lost. Whereas women don't really need to compete as much. It's pretty easy for a woman to find a partner who is willing to help her find a child, compared to the difficulty that a man faces finding a partner who is willing to have a child with him. So, and that is thought to lead to greater levels of competitiveness and aggression, physical aggression in men over the eons. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This may be dumb, but why do some women just have a little more testosterone? What makes aggressive women that way?
That's a good question. So why are there individual differences in female testosterone levels? And the answer is going to be a little complex. There are going to be some genetic factors. And there are probably going to be some environmental factors as well, depending on the types of things that someone is exposed to during the course of development. I don't know of any real ultimate explanations for those individual differences. I mean, we talked about evolutionary explanations of individual differences in that chapter, but the story for a lot of these things is, well, it's complicated. It's partly genetic, partly environmental. All right, other questions?
So, the last one on 16.
Androgyny?
Yep.
Is there any research support for it? What do you guys think? Not much. This is something they investigated a lot in the 70s. People started to question these traditional measures of gender, and they thought, well, there might be some people that are high in both masculinity and femininity, and that's really the definition of androgyny, being very masculine and very feminine at the same time. But there really aren't that many people out there, so they ended up going back to these bipolar measures of gender roles and masculinity versus femininity. So that's what androgyny is, and there isn't much support for it. Aren't that many androgynous people out there? So, what else? Yeah, I went over object relations theory earlier, and I mean I can come back to that, but I think you might have come in a little bit late, so I can get you after class, or if we finish early since we talked about that. Other questions? Yeah. Oh, sorry. It does. We can get above. Go.
On chapter 18, you said ways in which positive emotions can help cope with stress.
Okay, so yeah, how to use positive emotions for coping with stress. Does anybody remember the strategies that we talked about? I heard something very faintly out there. Yeah, positive reappraisal. Okay, yeah, so positive reappraisal. Something bad happens, try to just look at the good side of what's happening, right? So that was, a lot of times that can be kind of difficult, especially if it's a real tragedy, but it can help people. And then there's problem-focused coping, so rather than just, doesn't have as much to do with positive emotions, but rather than just freaking out, try to address the problem, and that can help people feel better, working toward a solution. And then creating positive events was one of my favorites. So just, if you're really stressed out, take a break from whatever's causing you stress and do something that you like, something that you enjoy, and that'll help people to cope with stress.
Chapter 19 on basic relationship.
Okay, so chapter 19, oops. Oh, that was on the other study guide, yeah. So know the relationship between stress, the immune system, and health. Yeah, that's right there. So what is that basic relationship? Stress good for you? No. No. Right, yeah, so people with type A personality are more likely to suffer from heart disease. I think that might be a separate thing in there. Yeah, type A personality and health.